Welcome to the Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Tonight, we're going to be thinking about, should Christians be doing philosophy at all? Is philosophy a threat to the Christian faith? Or should we just be content with a kind of feel-good faith? You know, if it makes you happy, if it works for you, then just go with it. Don't worry about these hard questions. All that we're going to talk about, sorry, with my guest, Dr. Morris. Hey there, Dr. Morris.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome. Thank you for coming on. So, Dr. Morris sent me a copy of her new book, Believing Philosophy, A Guide to Becoming a Christian Philosopher. And we're going to focus just on the first half of the book tonight. So, you begin the book. Well, actually, before we jump in, why don't you say a few words about what what led you to write this book?
Yeah, I would love to. Um, and I'll try to keep it to a few words. I can say a lot about this. So basically, the very short version is that I was a very serious Christian, even as a kid, pretty serious faith. Um, but for me, when my life got hard, philosophy was kind of a lifesaver. It's hard for me looking back to see how I would have persisted in my faith if I hadn't met some Christian philosophers. I trust God and His faithfulness, but for me, that was a huge, huge part of my process, just coming to understand or trying to understand God, to be at peace with God and with my faith in God the way that the world is. But when I decided to go on and pursue philosophy, I met a lot of suspicion and worry in the church. A lot of people who just thought this is dangerous, this is a bad idea. Fortunately for me, not within my own family and not with some really important Christians in my life, but I ran into it a lot. And so that was the first sort of tension. I just didn't understand why, and especially after graduate school, this discipline that was so formative for me, that helped me to read scripture better, that helped me to think more carefully about prayer, that helped me to be at peace in the world, was not finding a place in the church. I didn't understand that. And then I started attending a church that asked me to teach some classes on philosophy. And that's where the book really started. I started teaching these Wednesday night adult classes. Started out kind of talking about more Christian apologetics. And then as we went on, I thought, no, really, we just need to do some philosophy. So I did some basic classes on philosophy in the church. And then my pastor said to me, so when are you going to write the book? And that's what started it. It was a few years of me saying, I don't have time to do this, before it finally clicked and the opportunity came about and I was able to actually do it. So
That's really neat. I would have totally loved to sat in on those classes at your church. I don't think that's too common to have classes like that at church, though I think it's becoming more common. And hopefully the book sparks more things like that.
yeah, I hope so. I actually workshopped most of the chapters, or at least the first half, in classes at the church. I would give them chapters and we would talk about them. It was tremendously helpful for me to try to set the tone where I wanted it to be. I wanted to be able to have these conversations with people who did not get a PhD in philosophy and who maybe hadn't been in a college classroom in the last 10 years or ever. So it was also very helpful for me.
Cool. We've got a few people watching. One of them's Liz Jackson. She says hello. I think you two just went to the zoo together recently.
Yes, we also get to go to church together, which is a huge
Oh,
plus.
I didn't realize she attended your church. That's
Yeah.
neat. Cool. Okay. Well, so let's begin jumping into the book here. You start out by looking at just the discipline of philosophy. What is it? So that's a huge question. Many books with a variety of views have been written on this, but in your view, what is philosophy?
Yeah, it's the kind of question that every philosopher dreads because you know you should be able to give a good answer, but it's really hard to do so. So I was glad the book made me kind of narrow my thoughts down here. So I teach an intro class from time to time, and there's a book that I use that has a paper by Kahn, Kitcher, and Scher, I guess. And they really say that part of what shapes philosophy is that it asks questions that are highly general and highly fundamental. I think that's right. I think that's part of it, right? It asks questions that move in a more general direction, in a more fundamental direction. I also think it has to be in the pursuit of wisdom, which is what sets philosophy apart from just sophistry, right? From winning arguments and making other people look stupid. So that's the definition I went with, I think. The use of reason to raise highly general and highly fundamental questions with the goal of acquiring wisdom. There's a lot we could kind of unpack.
Yeah, why don't you, because you do spend some time in the book unpacking this, so why don't we take a few minutes and break that down? The use of reason to raise highly general and highly fundamental questions with the goal of acquiring wisdom. Break that down for us.
Okay, so I mean, the use of reason, I hope, is relatively self-explanatory. Use your mind, but when you think about questions, I think to show what it means for a question to be general or fundamental, it helps to start with a specific example. So suppose you're trying to figure out what you should do with your life, what you want to be when you grow up, um, and you ask yourself, what job should I try to get? That's a very specific question, and it's very particular. You're asking what you specifically, you as an individual, should take as a job in your life. To make the conversation a little more philosophical, you step back and you say something like, well, what kinds of jobs should people seek? What kinds of things should people spend their lives doing, right? And then you ask even further questions like, well, how do you make that decision? What kinds of things should you value? And in the concrete, you're going to be thinking about things like, will I make enough money? Will it leave me time for my family? Will it leave me time to be involved in my community? Or maybe you'll ask a very different, you'll be using a different set of values. Will it make, will I make enough money? Can I retire by 40? Will it allow me to buy a lake house? But even asking which values we should be weighing, right? Which questions we should be asking. These are moving things in the philosophical direction. So if you ask that not just for yourself, but people in general, then you've begun with this particular, specific, concrete, narrow question. What do I want to be when I grow up? And move to a more general and fundamental one. What kinds of things should people live their lives for? What kind of values ought people to maximize, and what should we try to avoid? Um, I don't know, I thought of two other quick examples. There's the difference. Suppose for your own country, you're wondering, should we enter into this war, right? Is this military conflict one that we should join? Well, philosophy says step back and ask in general, when are countries justified in going to war? In general, what makes violence justifiable? Is war ever just? If it is, what sets a just war apart from an unjust war? Those are more general and more fundamental because you started with a specific question about a specific country and a specific military conflict, and then you broaden to all countries and conflict in general, things like that.
Those are good examples. Yeah. Usually when um, so I made this video recently. It was like in a 60-second video of what's Christian philosophy. I start out by saying, okay, well, philosophy is concerned. I don't necessarily give a definition. It's just philosophy as a discipline
Yeah.
asks these types of questions. And then you notice that the questions that get listed are these very general and fundamental type questions that
Right.
like you're hinting at.
Yeah.
Um, and so, okay, so that much I think is clear in the definition what highly fundamental and general questions are. But you say that all this is has the goal of the reason you're even raising these is to acquire wisdom. So, do you want to try and connect that? Why is philosophy concerned with wisdom?
Sure. Well, so the word philosophy means the love of wisdom. So it better be concerned with wisdom, right? But also, I do think I get asked fairly frequently why I talk about Christian philosophy and not Christian apologetics. And I am not opposed to Christian apologetics. In fact, I think good Christian apologetics is Christian philosophy. But I think that there are some ways of doing apologetics that lose sight of the wisdom goal, where it really becomes about looking like the smartest person in the room and making other people feel foolish so that you win the argument. I don't think that's proper philosophy. I don't think that's, and actually this happens outside of, Christian context as well. It happens at philosophy talks. I don't think that's what we ought to be doing. It's fun to win an argument, right? But we're supposed to care about the truth here. That is supposed to be what we're after. And I think that when people who are studying philosophy lose sight of that, it's, I mean, at worst, it's dangerous, but even at best, it's just kind of wasteful. You're not doing what you set out to do. Also, I guess one more example. So here's a really classic case of philosophy asking you to move to a more general, more fundamental direction with the goal of wisdom, right? Maybe like me, you lived a pretty charmed life for a really long time. And then like me, some terrible tragedy happened. And so let's suppose your friend dies, right? And you think, how How could God let my friend die? How could God let my mom die? How could God let my little brother die? It's a very specific, particular question, and it's a hard question, right? One of the things that with time, right? I'm not saying that in the midst of your grief you should be forced to do this, but in time as a Christian, you ought to move in the direction of asking, well, of recognizing the generality here. When someone you love dies, the problem of evil and suffering in the world feels suddenly real to you. But it was real before it felt real to you. People have been dying at young ages and in awful ways forever. Um, it's through scripture too. This isn't something that God is surprised by. And so I think philosophy can help you to move from just thinking, because I am not the kind of Christian that believes that you will always get an answer to why specific bad things happen in your life while you're on this earth. I don't believe that. Um, you might sometimes. I think more often you don't. So if you want to know, like, why did God allow this specific thing to happen? I think you have much better luck pursuing the line that says, well, why does God allow these kinds of things to happen? Because he does. Um, and that helps you to think more about people in general. I think it is Simone Weil, who uses the language of, she says, most of us don't really believe that other people are real in quite the way that we are real. And in suffering alongside of people, you start to see them as just as real as you are. So this is just another case where in your grief and in your suffering and in your doubt, the questions of philosophy can lead you to see things, to see your circumstances rather as a part of a more universal shared experience, and I think to take you towards wisdom, right? Because you may not get the answer to why this specific bad thing happened, but I do think you can get a lot of wisdom about why God allows suffering and evil to happen. So that's maybe not quite as clear of an example. But.
So this may take us deeper into the weeds, but um, I'm not necessarily looking for a definition of wisdom. You can give me that if you want, but what what is wisdom when we say this is what we're trying to pursue? Like, what is that exactly? I've heard people talk about. I don't know how to say the word. Adam Pelser, when I interviewed him, uh, it's this word that I think Aristotle used. It's like eudaimonia or
Oh,
something like that.
eudaimonia. Yep,
Yeah,
eudaimonia.
well, how do you say it?
Eudaimonia, I think.
Eudaimonia. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's like built in or connected with wisdom, this idea of like wisdom or not. Yeah, you're the expert. I'm not the expert. You tell me.
Well,
How
I'm not
should
an Aristotle expert. I think eudaimonia, that is going back a really long time, right? I do contemporary philosophy of mind mostly, not Aristotle. But I think that's more flourishing than wisdom, but I'm not positive.
No, that's
Um,
how Adam Pelser was using it. I didn't know if
okay.
wisdom somehow is um like that falls under the umbrella of wisdom, but there's more to wisdom than that. But
Yeah, I was actually really careful not to give a definition of wisdom in the book because I tried and tried and I could not. And so I think what I did was I listed just quite a lot of descriptions from scripture of what wisdom is. I'd have to read it to you. But it's, I guess the shortest definition I would put is maybe, no, it's not really even wisdom, but seeking the truth, right? Caring about the truth, not instrumentally, not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. I think that's a good start for wisdom. I also think wisdom is acquired. I've been reading some not James, James Smith. I just finished his book, You Are What You Love, which I think is incredible. And he talks a lot about how wisdom is formed by habit, not in your head, just by thinking, right? And I think there's some truth there. So, yeah, I can't help giving the clearest
yeah.
succinct definition of wisdom.
Okay, so we've talked about philosophy a little bit more at the general level. Let's start thinking about Christian philosophy in particular. So, what is a Christian philosopher?
Depends on the context we're using the word in, right? Um, I think in the book I say there are maybe kind of three increasingly broad ways of understanding it. On the one hand, a Christian philosopher is somebody like me who is a Christian and an academic philosopher, right? That's a very narrow sense of the word. And you go just like a tiny bit broader if you include people that are not academic philosophers, but they're professional or just significant Christian apologetic practitioners, right? People who make their life's work in Christian apologetics. Some of whom are also philosophers, like William Lane Craig is clearly a Christian philosopher who also does apologetics. But that's not really the way I use the word either of those for most of the book. I just really mean a Christian who is going to be willing and interested in putting in this work to use reason to ask these kinds of questions, right? Yeah, so Christians who draw on the tools and resources of philosophy to examine and deepen and strengthen the foundations of their faith. And this is, in the book, I say that I hope that people who read the book end up as Christian philosophers. And that's what I mean, right? Just careful thinkers, Christians who are not afraid to think carefully about what they believe and why they believe it and whether those are good reasons, right? That to me is what it means broadly to just be a Christian philosopher.
So I qualify as a Christian philosopher under that
Absolutely.
definition.
Yeah.
That's very generous. I don't think of myself, I think of myself as a Christian that likes philosophy, but I don't ever think of myself as a Christian philosopher. The people I interview, I'm very comfortable saying, you're a Christian philosopher. But yeah.
I think you qualify. Yeah.
So, all right. Well, the next question I've got for you here: why should Christians embrace philosophy rather than just sticking to a quote feel good faith? And you may want to say what we mean by feel good faith,
Yeah.
because that can be appealing to a lot of people. I think a lot of people, that's a fairly common sense. I was just talking with somebody at work actually that was like, yeah, I mean, religion, it's all religions are basically the same. You just do what works for you. It was basically like that. So
Yeah.
why should we care about Christian philosophy as opposed to just sticking to a feel good faith?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's so common. I don't know how many people would say, yes, I affirm just to feel good faith, right? As Christians. Some would. But I think far more wouldn't recognize it necessarily, but are maybe in danger that that's what their faith has become or is becoming. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm just going to actually read. So I think here's what I wrote. So on this view, kind of feel good faith view, all that really matters is the role that faith plays in your life. If it makes you happy, that's great. If it doesn't, ditch it. If my faith makes me happy and makes you uncomfortable, then you should allow me to practice my faith in my private life, and I should do what I can to keep from imposing my faith upon you, right? We don't need to worry about disagreements or difficult questions or anything like that. So what's wrong with this? The philosopher in me can't resist the first response, which is like, we should care about the truth, right? We should care about what's actually true. Most of the major religions, all of the major religions, certainly share something like a broad moral code. But they disagree pretty significantly on the metaphysical claims about the world, whether God exists, whether God is a trinity, whether Jesus is God, or was just a prophet, or was just a regular person, or was maybe a misleader and a deceiver. These are like significant questions with significant disagreements. And they're questions about reality. And so I think that we should care about whether our beliefs correspond to reality. But more practically, for those of you who are like, well, you're not going to persuade me to care about philosophy by telling me to care about philosophy. It's not that simple. So I would say feel good faith is, I guess, it's not even harmless, but look, eventually it's going to stop feeling good, right? Eventually feel good faith is going to fail you because, I don't know if you've heard of that book, The Secret, that tells you to speak things into the universe will give them to you. It doesn't. That's not how the universe works, right? It's not how the universe works, rather. And so you will get to a point where I think it's more comfortable to give up the faith. I hit that point in my life where and I say this in the book actually, I remember feeling like it would actually be a lot more comfortable if I could just not believe in God. And I really wasn't able to stop believing in God, and I wrestled through it, and that was good for me. But it would have been a lot easier to think that the answer to why would God allow all this stuff to happen is he didn't, right? He's not real. But I also think, there's a temptation to think that everybody's story will be like your own. And I think that I have probably grappled with the suffering thing maybe more than is totally typical. It's not that I think everybody's going to run into some crisis But I do think that we really outgrow things that are just kind of accessories to our life. Think about your favorite band, your favorite food, that board game you played all the time. And like sometimes they stick with us for life, but often you just go through phases. And then you go into a new phase. And when your faith is like an accessory or just something that you do because it feels good in this non-offensive way, um, I just don't think you should expect it to stick, I guess. Um, I talk in the book about what Sam Harris calls the fireplace delusion. He talks about wood burning fires. And I grew up with a fireplace in my house. Absolutely loved it. Live in Florida now, so even if we had one, we'd never get to use it. But it was one of some of my favorite memories as a kid. Or my family would sit in the living room. We'd all have our own books, and we would just read around the fire. It was the best thing ever. And Sam Harris talks about how his friends love fireplaces, but they also claim to care about the environment. And apparently, the data is pretty clear that wood burning fireplaces are very bad for the environment. And Harris says, when he talks to his friends, his enlightened, rational friends who care about the environment and make other decisions on the basis of the environment, when he talks to them and confronts them about the harms of a wood burning fireplace, they all kind of justify and explain why, no, fireplaces aren't really bad. They just don't want to believe the science for this one comfort objective there. And Harris says that that's what Christians do, right? Harris says that he thinks theists, people who believe in God in general, um, don't really believe it, right? It's this comforting delusion that they're not willing to let go of. And I just think we should do better than that. And I think that more of us should work harder to make sure he's not right.
Something that comes to mind on this topic of feel good faith. I don't know if you're familiar with this parable or not, but I think J.P. Moreland made it up. I've heard it from him. I don't know if he got it from somewhere else, but it's this parable of Juan Mug. Have you heard him talk about that guy?
No.
Okay, I'll briefly mention it. So it's like Juan Mug is a total dummy. He doesn't know basic math. He can't multiply, he can't divide, he can't add or subtract. But everyone around him decides to play a joke on Juan Mug, including his professors. So they start giving him A's on all of his tests, and they tell him he's brilliant. They say when he asks a question in class, the professor will stop and say, "That's the most brilliant question I've ever been asked. I don't have an answer for you." Um, things like that. And he decides he's going to become a professor himself and start publishing papers. They're total nonsense. No, it doesn't make any sense. But he starts winning awards for these. Everyone's in on the joke. And what JP Moreland does at the end is Juan Mug feels really good, right? I mean, like for Juan Mug, that just he's living the dream. He has respect from all these people. Um, but then you ask yourself, would you want to be Juan Mug?
Yeah.
And my instinct is, or my intuition is no.
Mm-hmm.
But that means that I don't just care about how it feels. I actually care about what's reality, like what's actually true.
Yeah.
I always like that little parable to illustrate why I don't get into the feel good faith.
I think that's exactly right. And I actually think most of us care more about the truth than just about how we feel for things that we really care about. I use a really similar story with my students, only what I have found works best for them is if I talk about a romantic relationship. Just say, imagine you live your life, you've been married for 40 years, and when you die, you've lived your whole life believing that you were in a monogamous, happy marriage. In reality, your spouse was cheating on you the whole time, but was really careful, right, that you never found out. Do you want that life? And a handful of them were like, well, if I never find out and my friends didn't know, that's fine. But most of them were like, well, no, of course not, right? Even if I never find out, even if my friends never find out. So you don't have the embarrassment kind of factor. They want the truth. They would rather have a real and complicated relationship than a seemingly perfect one that feels great that is ultimately a lie. And I think that you're right. That's the best reason to not be content with a feel good faith.
So we do at some point have to get beyond the
Yes.
surface level stuff, and we'll end up with hard questions.
Yeah.
But it can be worth it.
Hmm.
So a couple of people watching, Liz included, said that for some reason I seem to be able to hear you fine, but they asked that you move a little closer to the microphone.
I can do that.
I'm not sure why there's that difference. I can hear you, but okay. Yeah, it looks like you're closer there. Good. All right. So we talked about what philosophy is, what Christian philosophy is in particular, and why people should embrace Christian philosophy. You spend a couple chapters in the book um, going over some tools that Christian philosophers can use. So, what are some of these tools that you have in mind, conceptual tools, I mean, uh, that can actually help shape your faith?
Yeah. So I think one of the most important distinctions that obviously I think it's important to spend a few chapters unpacking it. That I think Christians, I actually think everybody would benefit from this, but talking to Christians in particular, is the distinction between whether your belief is reasonable and whether it's true. And I'm not sure why, but I feel like our culture more broadly has lost track of this a little bit. I have a friend who thinks it's maybe because we teach our kids in elementary school to distinguish facts from opinions, which is mistaken, right? Because you can have opinions that are factual or that are false. But right out the gate, we teach our children that there are facts, and then there's this other realm of things that you really only judge based on whether they make you happy or not, or whether you like them. So what am I getting at here? Every college professor I know, especially philosophy professors, struggles a little bit with the current obsession with a kind of relativism, right? And this all goes back to the feel good faith too. You couldn't believe feel good faith without some dose of this kind of relativism, which is it kind of takes it a step further. It's not just, well, it's great if you believe in God, and if I don't, that's no problem. It goes one step further and it says, well, and it can be true for you that God exists, and true for me that God doesn't exist, because we're not really talking about um, truth is this objective thing, right? Truth is just relative to the individual. Um, Except it can't be if we all live in a shared world, right? And I won't go too far down that path, but against relativism, because let's see, what's worth saying here? Well, yeah, here's the very simple question. When I say that God exists, I mean that an actual existing, eternal, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, supernatural being actually created this earth and the whole universe, right? And the world that we live in. And when you say God doesn't exist, you think that same being doesn't exist and that this same earth was not created by that God. We just can't both be right because we live on the same planet in the same universe, right? And contradictions aren't possible. It can't be that this earth was created by God and not created by God. But here's what I've found in recent years. Instead of despairing about this rise of relativism, I think I've come to believe that it comes from a pretty good place. I think it's misguided and confused. But I do think that we have gotten better in recent decades in recognizing that people have radically different experiences of the same world, right? We live in the same world, we experience it very differently. And so we might come to very different conclusions. And I think there's this hesitancy to condemn or judge somebody else because you don't know what their experiences are like. So how can you tell them what views they should have arrived at? So here's where this distinction comes in, right? Because in philosophy, this is not controversial or anything. It's very rudimentary level. There's this one question. Are your beliefs held on the basis of good reason, or are they held on the basis of bad reason? And then there's this other question that asks, are your beliefs true? Do they correspond to the world as it is? But these are not the same question. And when we mash them together, then we don't want to tell somebody their belief is false because we hear that as invalidating their experience. But I think that when you give people this distinction, you give them the ability to say, or to at least believe, even if they don't say this in every conversation, right? Yeah, I understand why you believe that, and I can see why, given your experiences, that's what you've come to believe. But I believe something different, and we can't both be right, and I think I'm right. We might both be rational, right? It's possible for you for you to believe something that is contradictory to what I believe, and for us both to have really good reasons for that. So I might have. Here's an example I use in the classroom. Let's suppose that my father announces to the country that he's running for president, and he spends a couple $1 million on an ad campaign. And so everybody in the country believes that my father is running for president, except for me and my mom, because we know this is all a joke. Because his like best friend from grad school wanted to run for president, and he was pranking him by throwing his name in the hat first, right? And he's got enough money that he's happy to throw a couple $1 million at this prank. That's just kind of how he lives. But we know that he's already booked, he's already accepted a job in another country. We know that we're leaving the country. I am totally confident, and I reasonably believe that my father is not actually going to run for the president, right? But you have really good reasons to believe that he is going to run for the presidency, right? You've been given bad evidence, but that's not your fault. You are following the evidence responsibly. It's taking you to a false belief, right? Unless it turns out my dad was actually pranking me and my mom, in which case our good reasons led us to a false belief. But the point is this, right? You can have a belief that's reasonable. You hold it on the basis of good reasons, and it's true because it corresponds to reality. Hopefully, most of our reasonable beliefs are true. But you can have a belief that you hold on the basis of good reason that turns out to be false anyway. Because you can get bad evidence, right? Sometimes because people lie to you, but sometimes just because our science is not significantly advanced enough, or our access to the evidence is not very good. I'm sorry, I'm going on for a long time here.
No, all that was really good. I'm glad you laid that out. Yeah, truth and what's rational can come apart, but I like that
Absolutely.
you're and you can give cases to illustrate how they come apart. I like the what you're giving where you can actually have um, you can be rational in believing something that's false,
Mhm.
uh, and you can also be obviously you can be rational believing something that's true. In that case, we just have different pieces of evidence. You've got evidence that say I don't have. If I'm on the outside, I just see ads for this guy. I'm operating on the basis of just that evidence. You have additional evidence that I don't have access to. Um, yeah, it seems like as long as we have uh, different evidence, then yeah, there's no reason to think that we can't both be rational.
Exactly. And so you can disagree with somebody without accusing them of using their reason poorly, right? You can now, if you're both looking at exactly the same evidence, it gets trickier because then you disagree about where the evidence points. But it's very rare. It's very rare for us to encounter people that don't have any different evidence than us, right? You grew up with an abusive father and you were told that God is like a father. You've got pretty different evidence from me, who grew up with a great father, right? Um, these are contributing factors. So I don't know. I find it easier to kind of confront the challenge of relativism if I can do it in a way that gives credence to the desire to treat people as rational people, right, and to not be dismissive of disagreements, but also to not allow that disagreement to collapse into incoherence by just saying, "Well, I guess we could both be right then," right?
All right, you actually, I'm going to skip this part of the book. You include a couple of chapters. I thought this was really good on um, just how to reason well. Uh, so you know basic forms of arguments and how to evaluate. You have a piece, somebody said something, or you've got something written in front of you, and you're trying to figure out what is the argument this is actually making. You go through all that in the book. We're going to skip that part, but I think those tools are super important, and the people watching should get the book and read those two chapters. They're a very, very good introduction to just good critical thinking. Uh, but we're approaching the end here, and we're about to go to Q&A from the viewers soon. So I'll go ahead and say that there's one question in the live chat that I see from Caesar. But if you have a question for Dr. Morris, go ahead and type it in the live chat. Just put the word question at the beginning, and then it's easy for me to find. Okay, so one more question, and then we'll start to wrap up here. Let's look at some objections that have been raised against Christian philosophy. And you mentioned, from what I can tell, four in the book. And there's a couple that I may add if there's some time left. But the first objection that you mentioned is, you've defined philosophy as this goal of using reason to acquire wisdom, but doesn't the Bible say that wisdom comes from God alone? Why are you trying to, use like your own power, trying to get wisdom? That's just a gift from God. So what do you say about that objection?
Yes, no, I definitely get that objection. Um, and I would say, yes, yes, I believe that wisdom comes from God. That's why I believe that pursuing wisdom should bring you closer to God, right? I really do believe that. Um, but I also think that we are told in Scripture, we are biblically enjoined to seek wisdom as a treasure, to pursue it, right? So if the way that wisdom came from God was by a kind of God just gifts it at you and puts it in your head, I don't think we would be told to seek after it like a treasure, right? And we are. Also, absolutely, wisdom comes from God. I mean, that's the question, right? How do we get the wisdom from God to us? Which I think leads right to one of the next ones, which is, well, isn't the Bible enough, right? If wisdom comes from God, then at the very least, if you're going to look anywhere for it, you should just look in the Bible. I do, again, believe that the Bible is a really important source of God's wisdom, the best source that we have. But we read the Bible with so many filters, really, right? None of us reads it in its original language. We all read it in translation. I did not realize what that meant really until I learned a second language. I was an adult. I learned German. I went and lived in Germany for a few years, and I'm telling you, it was revolutionary for me to revelatory rather to see just all that goes into translation. You know, when I only knew one language, I thought translation was basically you look a word up in the translating dictionary and there you have it. But it isn't. There are so many there are so many things that go into meaning. But I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, which I really could go down. And I will just say, yes, wisdom comes from God. Yes, it's in the Bible, but we've got to find it. We have to make some effort towards receiving this wisdom from God well. I imagine we have all seen Scripture taken badly out of context and quoted to 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 claim that God has said something that God has not said, right? And so this is why I think having these reasoning skills, for me, they made me a much better reader of the Bible, a much more careful, um, reader of Scripture.
Yeah, so you kind of answered two in one there. And I'll mention on well, okay, in response to that, the question I asked about doesn't wisdom come from God alone?
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a helpful distinction you made in the book between you acquiring that wisdom passively versus actively. So we all want to say, yes, it comes from God. Um, but does God just kind of, zap it into your head? Or is it something that, like you said, you actively seek out like a treasure? Um, and yeah, it seems like we have good reason from scripture to think that it's uh, there. I'm not saying that God can't passively put wisdom in your head, but yeah, it seems like the kind of thing that we actively seek out and acquire.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it seems like he may have zapped Solomon like that, right? But he's the exception. Most of us, the language is clear and it is so active. You know, seek, go after, pursue. These are all things that are being asked of us.
and then going ahead and connecting that with the additional objection about the Bible. So the idea there is, okay, well, God's given us the Bible, and that's all we need for wisdom. So I don't need to learn any philosophy. I just need to read my Bible, and there you go. I will acquire all the wisdom I need. End of story.
Mhm.
So I know you touched on that. Do you want to say more about that?
Sure, yeah, I'll give one little example. When I was in high school or college, I'm not sure, my mom recommended a book to me. It's called A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. And it's just this short little book. I really recommend it. I mean, I haven't read it in years, but I do look at it from time to time. And it is a shepherd, a professional shepherd, or I think, um, just unpacking some of the language of Psalm 23 in the way that only a shepherd could. And it's such a tiny little snippet. But the Bible was written in a different culture, in a different time period, and a different language from where we all are right now. we can and should sit down and just read it, right? But we should also seek resources that help us to fill in the context that original readers would have had, right? Because I think I don't. Well, here's a. I mean, even just expressions, right? If somebody tells you to get all your ducks in a row, right? You'll know what they mean. Get organized, get things together. But somebody in the second language is going to hear that and think, wait, did I misunderstand that? Is that a translation problem? Why would they be talking about ducks? Language is like that, right? And so we have to approach the Bible, I think, understanding that. And we get the Bible that way. We get it through the theological broad ideas of whoever is preaching to us, right, of our pastors, and we import our own kind of cultural ideas. We, um, yeah, I guess just very briefly, we see scripture and we see the promise of blessings. And as people who have lived in a world of antibiotics and clean water, we think that means we're going to have a long and healthy and prosperous life. If you look at the history of humanity and the history of the church, nobody could have believed the prosperity gospel prior to a certain time period because they'd have 10 babies and maybe 4 of them would survive, right? Um, I just think it's important to be mindful of all that we bring with us when we sit down to read the Bible and to bring in other resources to help us recognize what we're bringing and what we're encountering there in the Bible.
Yeah. Um, okay. So a third objection that you mentioned in the book is that philosophy, and these next two are somewhat interrelated. So I might just go ahead and say them together because they're closely related. Philosophy breeds doubt. And that's the very thing that the book of James tells us that we shouldn't be doing is doubting. It says to pray, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's um, don't be like this one that's tossed about because of their doubts.
Mm-hmm.
You're supposed to pray in faith, but
Yeah.
philosophy seems like it breeds doubt. So, and then just going ahead and tagging this on, it seems like many people who end up studying philosophy become atheists. So, shouldn't that mean Christians should stay away from it? I went ahead and mashed those two together. You can unpack your response.
Yeah, no, they work together. Yes, so breeding. I want to start with the first comment about breeding doubt, and I am just going to read some C.S. Lewis to you, actually, because I just found this quote the other day, and I wish I'd had it. I wish I'd used it in the book, because he starts out. This is in Mere Christianity, towards the end, book 4, I guess. He writes, "Everyone has warned me not to tell you what I'm going to tell you in this last book. They all say, the ordinary reader doesn't want theology. Give him plain, practical religion. I have rejected their advice." And then on the next page, he writes, "Theology is practical, especially now. In the old days, this is what feels most relevant." And think, of course, I'm talking about philosophy and not theology, but C.S. Lewis saw those things as entwined, and so do I, right? I'm going to read this and remember that this was before the internet, right? This was his view before the internet. In the old days, when there was less education and discussion, perhaps it was possible to get on with a few very simple ideas about God. But it is not so now. Everyone reads. Everyone hears things discussed. Consequently, if you don't listen to theology, that will not mean that you have no ideas about God. It will mean that you have a lot of wrong ones, bad, muddled, out of date ideas. Um,
It's
for a
even
great
more true now that
It's so much more true now. And he goes on, for a great many of the ideas about God, which are trotted out as novelties today, I would say on the internet, are simply the ones that real theologians tried centuries ago and rejected. Um, I think the same is true for philosophy. Yeah, we're told not to be deceived by philosophy. And I think a great way to not be deceived by philosophy is to learn to recognize the difference between philosophy that's seeking wisdom and rhetoric and sophistry. If you don't recognize bad philosophy, I think you're more likely to fall for it. We haven't talked about the new atheists yet, but I think that's the best diagnosis of why the new atheists have been as successful as they have. Atheistic academic philosophers do not find them impressive. They find them a little embarrassing. So the reason that so many young people have, I think, been kind of caught up in their teaching is that they don't have a solid philosophical background to help them kind of recognize the old bad arguments. Oh,
Yeah.
and as for it being an atheistic discipline, I know we're low on time. I'll just say this one thing. Um, what I love, what I loved as a Christian doing philosophy, in so many disciplines, psychology, anthropology, sociology, the sciences, what you believe about God is not up for discussion in the classroom. But often, to participate, you kind of have to adopt an atheistic or agnostic, kind of a naturalistic worldview, right? Just to get in on the conversation. The background assumptions that everybody shares is pretty much a naturalistic worldview. What I love about philosophy is the worldview itself is on the table for discussion. I think that's a great place to have Christians in the classroom, right? Where you actually get to talk about, well, why is it a naturalistic worldview that we're asked to assume?
Yeah. And that last objection, I have a family member who that that came up. That was a piece of advice offered was when going to college, don't take any philosophy classes because so and so took one and it really confused them, and many people become atheists. So just
Yeah,
stay away from that.
yeah,
So it's definitely out. That's definitely an idea that's out there. But yes, I like what you said that in a philosophy class, um, the worldview itself is on the table and up for discussion. That's not the case in like a chemistry class
right,
or
right.
even like the humanities, like you mentioned with
Mm-hmm.
sociology and stuff. If you're studying some tribe, I think you mentioned that in the book. You don't really discuss whether that tribe's beliefs are true or false.
That's right.
You just are more or less just describing what their beliefs are. You're not saying and you should adopt them or you should reject them or something like that.
Yeah,
But in philosophy, you actually do evaluate those beliefs.
yeah.
Um,
I
and
also, sorry.
yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
I just want to say, like in defense of your family member and in the people who've said those things to me, these things do happen. Christians do start studying philosophy and leave their faith sometimes. That's one of the reasons that I wrote the book, is that there are all these professional Christian philosophers, and then there are all these Christians in the church, and there's this disconnect. They don't talk to each other, um, and I mean, it's difficult to put your beliefs on the table for discussion, and it's challenging and it's hard. It's easier if you know other Christians who are doing it with you, and especially if you know some Christian philosophers. So, one of the things I've been trying to do with this book is bridge that gap, right? Get get people Christians who, when they start studying philosophy, to read some Christian philosophers, right? To not just dive themselves into. I mean, yes, if you're at college, take a philosophy class. That's great. A lot is going to depend on who your professor is. And there are some professors that are really pretty hostile to Orthodox religious belief of any kind. So I don't want to be like minimizing of that worry or dismissive of it because I think it's real. But I think the answer isn't to sort of hide in fear, but instead to maybe do a better job arming ourselves, right? I don't usually like battle imagery really, but just to be prepared and make sure that if your first foray into philosophy includes a lot of atheistic stuff, make sure you're also reading philosophy by thoughtful Christians. Um, Even just C.S. Lewis is a great place.
right, right. And as we mentioned at the beginning, with this, I know you said you were hesitant to give a definition of wisdom, but if
Right.
part of being wise is pursuing truth, it could be more than that. But if part of it's pursuing truth, and that's a really valuable thing in itself, then yeah, we should care about pursuing truth. And here's a thought that that I've had at least for a while now. Um, it seems like Scripture tells us to seek the truth as well. Like I'm pretty sure there's in several of Paul's letters he says like love what's true. I think he said it somewhere, and I there's like a list. It's like love what's true, love what's this. Uh, Jesus is said to be the truth, and
Mm-hmm.
obviously we're supposed to pursue Jesus. So it seems like if you really take um, Christianity seriously, you're very committed to pursuing what's true. And so philosophy is very good at giving tools to help evaluate, like we talked about, what's true, what's reasonable. Um, so it just seems like a natural fit. And yes, there are people that study philosophy and become atheists. But given, for me anyway, given my Christian commitments, I don't want just to feel good faith. I want to pursue what's true, I seek it there.
Yeah.
Okay. So before we go to Q&A, I'll say this one more time. If you've got a question for Dr. Morris, go ahead and type the word question at the beginning and then say ask away. We've got at least one in the live chat, but before we go to that, I wanted to mention this. Liz said, one thing I love about, oh, well, there was another one right here. We can go to that one. She said, I think knowing about smart Christian philosophers who are publishing in defense of Christianity also helps.
Yeah.
And that, I will say, has been a huge help to me, because when I say pursue truth, you want to be learning from the best, and there are many brilliant Christian philosophers that are defending Christian beliefs, and you want to know what they say and weigh that against those who don't agree. Say,
Yes. And
um,
sorry,
go
just
ahead.
to jump in, I also think that I just think we should be really careful not to tell young people not to study philosophy, because I think anytime you send them the message, right? Well, don't ask the hard questions. Um, the message you're sending them is we don't have answers to the hard questions. And I think that Liz is right, that even just letting people know that there are, like, well, how come God lets children suffer, right? Nobody ever talks about that. And the answer is, of course they do. And there are people who have really wrestled with these hard things, and questions about pluralism, and questions about the incarnation, and have done so as Orthodox Christian believers working as academic philosophers. I think Liz is right. That should also boost our confidence in the truth of Christianity.
Okay. One more objection before we go. Actually, no, you already touched on it, so I'm going to set that one aside. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the viewers' questions. Um, so Caesar asked, what would be the essentials of Christian philosophy as opposed to non-Christian philosophies?
Okay. Um, so so I think there's a few ways I can interpret that question, but so I think what the essential that distinguishes like the philosophical position as being Christian as opposed to not being about Christian, not being Christian, would come down to questions about Christ, I think, and the divinity of Christ. But if what you're asking is like what makes a Christian philosopher in some sense different from somebody who is a philosopher and not a Christian, um, and if that's not what you're asking, you can correct me. Well, in both cases, right, it comes down to Jesus. Christ is central to whether something is Christian or not. I do think that Christian philosophers have a sort of different constraint, although I think that atheistic philosophers have constraints of their own. There's this sense, in fact, sometimes people will make the accusation that you can't be a Christian philosopher because you've already sort of settled the issue about Christianity, and so you're not a true philosopher anymore. But the truth is, no true philosophers are out there in the world without any fixed beliefs, right? Just with everything on the table all the time, that they're willing to let go of anything that they believe in. Like I say in the book, Dennett is not like open to being convinced of theism every time he reads a paper about Christianity. Um, and I think that all of us have to walk this balance where you really ought to have epistemic humility. You really ought to, the philosophical term I know, but I wish it was more broadly used, be a little humble about how much you know, right? One of the greatest comforts to me hit me around high school, actually. Um, the disciples don't come off very well in the Gospels. They come off all right, but there are moments where you're like, you understand why Jesus says, how long do I have to put up with these people? But they like lived with him. They lived with him and walked with him and ministered with him, and they were shocked at his death and then shocked again at his resurrection. So I just like to think, yeah, we're going to be surprised. There are things that are going to surprise us. And I think that's where epistemic humility comes in, not being overconfident in our understanding. But we do have the constraint, I think. Whatever, when I'm practicing philosophy, I do keep scripture as a kind of a check on the limits of what I'm going to really give credence to. Maybe going too long on this one question.
We're coming up on an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and squeeze in the questions that my patrons submitted. So now's a good time to mention this. If you really enjoy this video, consider liking it, subscribing to the channel. And if you value the work that I'm doing, if you value Christian philosophy and you think that a channel like this is important and more people should know about it, then please consider becoming one of my patrons. It's in the link to become a patron is in the description of the video, along with the link to Dr. Morris's book. So, and by the way, one of the viewers actually said in the live chat that they're going to purchase the book.
Okay,
So
thank you.
they liked what they heard. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go to my patrons' questions now. One question was, how can we make Christian philosophy more inclusive so that more Christians feel comfortable participating in it?
I think that's a really good question. It's also a hard question. Um, I, Getting back to this notion of epistemic humility, I think that those of us who work in professional philosophy should work a little harder to be more accessible. Um, I, there is some incredible Christian philosophy that is really powerful and good, and impenetrable at a first reading. And people like Eleanor Stump, right, who writes these incredible books. They're amazing. They're like 800 pages long. But what she has started doing is speaking on podcasts, right? Which I think is so important because she can condense her 800-page book into 45 minutes of the bare bones of it. I think we need to do more things like that. I also think, depending on what you mean by being more accessible, um, I think inviting a wider variety of people to conferences is important. Um, Trying to make sure that you're not just inviting the same four people to be the main speaker at every conference about Christian philosophy. People have been working pretty hard on that recently. Um, and just being open to charitable disagreement, right? Christian philosophers ought to be able to have conversations with people that disagree with them about Christianity, even if they both call themselves Christians. Like, I feel like philosophers ought to be able to do this better than they sometimes are because we are also human. But I think all of these things help, right? Having conversations, in being careful about our tone. Philosophers tend to be sort of quick and snappish with each other in talks. It doesn't bother me, but I know that it bothers some people. I know it especially bothers some women, and I get it. So I think I think aiming for an approachable attitude. I know I don't want to jump to another patron question, but there was a question about whether Christians that are seeking would be welcome at a
Yeah,
philosophy
you can go ahead
conference.
and say
Yeah.
that now.
Um, and I would want to say sometimes more than others, and hopefully more and more in the future, right? When I ran the Society of Christian Philosophers conference here in Tampa, I actually had one day of the 3-day conference, one full day. We held it at my local church instead of on campus. And I put a full day of talks. I asked people to write some talks that were a little more accessible. And that was a 1-day Christian philosophy conference with academic Christian philosophers who did the work of trying to present their papers in accessible language. More and more of us are concerned about that. Megan Sullivan at Notre Dame has done a lot of work in public philosophy. So the answer is sometimes you would show up. I have friends who've had this experience. You'd go to the Christian philosophy conference because you're a philosophically curious Christian, and you would find them talking about things that make no sense and seem utterly unimportant. And spoiler alert, like maybe are unimportant, I don't know, but that we love, right? These fun little analytic philosophy games. Um, so you just kind of have to see. I'm pretty sure that the January conference at Palm Beach Atlantic is going to be. They have a master's program with kind of an emphasis on public philosophy. So I'm expecting this conference to be a little bit more accessible. Also, Robert Garcia is a keynote speaker. If you live in Florida, I would come to that conference. There should be some good accessible stuff there, and we're working on it.
Excellent. Okay, this will be the last question. We're coming right up on an hour. So, let me pull it up. Wrong place. Yeah. Okay. At what ages should we introduce our children to Christian philosophy, and what resources are available to parents? Don't feel rushed. Take time to answer it. If we go over an hour, that's fine.
Okay. Um, well, there is disagreement within the Christian philosophical community about this. I have friends who, uh, Michelle Panchuk, over lockdown, she hosted like a philosophy for kids Zoom session. weekly or bi-weekly or something like that, where she just kind of introduced philosophical concepts to young elementary school age kids. Um, and I know that there's some talk in the Society of Christian Philosophers about trying to come up with broader resources. I tend to be on the other end of things. I think high school is a much better age, but I have I met my husband in graduate school. So my children have the misfortune of having two philosophy PhD parents. And it seems we don't talk shop at home very much. They don't really let us. Liz can attest to this. I'm not making it up. There seems to be an actual philosophy gene, and my children got double doses. And so I have watched, I had a 2 year old who wondered if she was dreaming. And whatever I would tell her, here I am with you. She would say, that's just what you would say if this was a dream. And walk away. I think some of the questions that philosophy raises are just too big for the cognitive capacities of young children. Not everybody agrees on this. Some people think, no, start them early. And I don't know that I'm right. But because I have kids who are naturally very philosophical, I've maybe seen more of the costs than the benefits. I'm sure there are benefits too, but it's a lot. It's a lot to wrestle with when you're still trying to figure out the world and growing in your body. Um, I think middle school, high school is a great age. Some middle schoolers, other kids not till high school. And I think C.S. Lewis is a great place to start. I really do. Um, my son read Screw Tape Letters in about seventh grade, and that was a great, just like first foray into this stuff. Um, I just had a thought fly off here. Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, we're at an hour and a minute, so
Okay.
that's good.
All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morse, for coming on and spending an hour
Oh, wait, I do
going
have
through
to
some of
say
the
it.
book.
I'm sorry. I just have. Do you mind?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I apologize because I just remembered because it was important. There is an exception. I do think if your children start asking philosophical questions, that's the time to start talking about it with them, right? So my kids are philosophically inclined. We don't squash the questions. We talk about them with them. I think that's really important. I just don't know that I would proactively introduce philosophy to young children, but I would 100% respond in a positive way if they get there on their own. Again, I think it's a bad message to tell children not to ask questions that they're already asking. Okay.
Yeah, that's important. Okay. Well, thank you, and I'll mention it once more. There's a link in the description of this video to this book on Amazon. Dr. Morris wrote it. I've put a review on Amazon. I thought it was really good. A really good place, especially if you're already kind of interested in Christian apologetics, but you want to branch out a little bit more. You're wanting to see what else you can do besides just like arguments for God's existence or why we trust the Bible or something like that. I think this is a very, very good place to begin that journey and go much, much deeper. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.